they're not a residential student. So, you know, the case manager has this flexibility. I've heard a case manager almost described as a mobile resident director, that instead of having a case manager tied to, say, a building and a group of students, that what we're doing instead is tying them to a group of at-risk students that might be spread all around campus or off campus, that we're seeing the same kind of skill set we'd like to see from an RD attached to a group of at-risk students.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's the whole idea, is to attach them to the issue, the area of concern, a particular student, so that they have the flexibility then to take that forward back out onto the campus setting and into the various departments.
Yeah. As we look at case management developing, it lives in a lot of different places. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it lives within counseling, student affairs, part of the behavioral intervention team within residential life. I think it's less important to see where it lives than to understand that it's tasked with this idea of integration and working with students. Some limitations I would say right off the bat is if it's living within counseling, your case manager might have a little more restriction in terms of sharing and confidentiality. Mm-hmm. If they are seen as a client of the center, immediately you're going to have a bit more, a couple more hoops to jump through in terms of developing information flow, as compared to if the student, if the case manager lived within, say, residential life or a student affairs office. They might be governed with a slightly more flexible standard like FERPA over state confidentiality law.
That's true. And sometimes they just have to deal with these sort of identity crisis issues that go on. They're part of a BID team, a counseling center, an RA department, whatever it might be, but at the same time they're there to advocate for the student. Mm-hmm. So it does need to be made clear where they live and what that means to everyone else who may be involved in the case management program.
Two main models, and I think the third Carolyn's mentioned is this off-campus, this idea of bringing in a separate company to do that, which I think is an interesting option as well. We usually see case managers living within a counseling center, or there's that more administrative model, and that administrative model really falls within, gosh, a whole number of different areas. And some of this might be funding driven. If you do have a department, say even an academic department that has a little more flexibility in terms of setting aside a salary or developing this, or even a police department that might have access to some, you could see your police department as part of the BIT, and they might have access to some funds that they want to put towards prevention as opposed to crisis response. They might be the place that case management ends up living.
Also important when making a determination as to where they live and what their functions are is to develop the policies and procedures that go with that, so that it's clear. It goes to education and training to make sure that people are aware of what the policies and protocols are. That goes specifically with case management.
Yeah, and there's a number of schools that have already, you know, if I'm tasked with creating a policy or procedure manual, the first thing I'm going to do is go on my listserv and say, are there other schools out there who are already doing this, so I'm not recreating the wheel? Mm-hmm. Tulane has a wonderful case management program. That's one school to consider contacting, and Gonzola, I think I might be mispronouncing that university as well, has a good program. So looking out there to see who's already doing this and starting from their policy and procedure manual might be a way to kind of get out ahead of that.
Right, but I would also suggest that the procedures be run through your risk management department or your campus legal counsel or your off-campus legal counsel to make sure they're compliant with federal and state law, as well as address any potential liability concerns and try to close those gaps as well. Much
better to do that in a preventative way before the problems start.
Yes, it is.
I'd imagine as legal counsel you never want to have, oh, so here's our manual and this is why we're getting sued. You know, you want that manual first.
Oh yes, we want to see that first. It's very hard to do damage control when it's out there, printed, publicized, and people rely on it in the wrong way.
We won't belabor this point too much, but I can't completely avoid a history lesson. That this idea of case management really comes out of the deinstitutionalization method within movement within mental health care, and this happened back in the 60s and early 70s. We're moving away from sending people with mental illness up on the hill to these old institutions. This was how we dealt with mental health problems. Back then we sent people to a place where they were fixed and then maybe return to the community. And there was really a shift there where we saw instead having them come back into the community and actually providing some of that service. We see education following this with mainstream classroom education, that we see that just sending students who are struggling away to be fixed and then try to return them, that creates some problems. So if a student's struggling, the idea of trying to service them within the community and attaching someone to them rather than requiring them to go to a certain place can work well.
Oh, absolutely.
Again, some history here. There was a shift in some of the laws back then where we saw that there was this push to move away from this. Some of it was cost-driven, some of it was morality-driven in terms of care provisions. But we see this as, I think, the precursors of social work, this idea of getting out there and working with students. And if I can, I guess if I'm an audience member, I might be concerned at this point about the touchy-feely nature of case management. Or we were just arguing for creating yet another service that counseling can offer. And to me, it's so much more than that, but I don't know that I'm articulating it well. How do you see it?
Well, because they actually leave the counseling center and go out into the world, so to speak.
Right.
And I have found over the years, case managers, in large part, are social workers or social worker trained. But I'm starting actually to see an increase in nurses going into this area. And the benefit of someone with a clinical background is that they can interpret and work with the clinical issues that often accompany students who come to campus with serious mental illness or substance abuse issues or kids on the autism spectrum. So you may want to look at how do you combine sort of the social aspects of this, the social services aspects of this, with the clinical aspects, which is a large part of what they deal with very often, and make that either part of your training or look for it in terms of credentialing of case managers whom you may hire on your campus or with whom you may want to contract if it's an off-campus independent contractor arrangement.
Sure. I mean, you might have a student that comes up through student conduct and they don't have a mental health issue, but the issue for them is around alcohol and drug abuse.
Right.
And this is their third alcohol and drug abuse offense on your campus. You're concerned about them. Connecting them up to a case manager and then encouraging some type of assessment, follow-through, maybe it's even getting them, or as part of the sanction, they might have to go to a harm management or an AA meeting, that you're really helping that student overcome the obstacles that they need to be successful on campus and follow through with the sanctioning from, say, a conduct board. So it's that really creative obstacle kind of overcoming piece that my tendency is to see things from a counseling lens, yet you can see this, I think, with almost any student behavior. If you have a disruptive student in the halls, even the things we're looking for now in terms of violence prevention on campus, we might see a student who's isolated, who's being teased or bullied by another set of students. Maybe the behavioral intervention team identifies this student as a risk. So then attaching this person to that student in a proactive way, taking them out for coffee, having a conversation about how they're doing, what could they need, what do they need to be more successful at college, or as part of a standard process. Maybe the dean calls that student in, and then the dean says, I'd like you to meet with this case manager over the next month or two, say once or twice a month, just to make sure that you're doing okay. So then you're creating that kind of monitoring piece to this, because we know that one of the dangers that comes with violence is that these students get into trapped, irrational ways of thinking, and then no one can kind of get through that shell. So if you're connecting someone to them, that's a good place to be.
Well, we also know the issue of isolation is a big factor in violence, and the case managers can break through some of that isolation. Also, looking at the breadth and depth of experience of the case managers whom you might be thinking about hiring. Yeah. I always believe there's a lot to be said for experience. Yeah. And I think the campuses are going to have to get used to the idea that case management is not going to come from the campus world necessarily or the higher ed world, because this is new to the higher ed world. And look to the healthcare world, the mental health world, use those models, which have worked pretty successfully for many years. And if you need to retrofit them to a campus site or a campus setting, but the more experience and the greater the training and experience, I think the more effective the case managers can be.
Yeah, they're going to have a level of charisma, a level of connection. They can't look at a situation and say, these students these days, they don't get it, and they're never going to get it. They need to go home. And you can't have a person in a case management position with that kind of attitude. You need to have someone who's going to be connecting with the students and feeling helping them achieve. Really, in the counseling world, this is described in motivational interviewing, in Prochaska and DiClemente's change model. We have really well-developed theories on how we help people change, and simply saying, go do that is not the most effective model of change. How do you change behavior? I don't change behavior well just having someone yell to me to go do it, or very authoritarian kind of, you must do this. So case management really takes that more teaching developmental approach to changing behavior.
It's a very interpersonal position, and you have to be sensitive to the personalities who are going into this field, who will be working on your campus, who have an appreciation for the complexities of a college campus and be able to work within that particular milieu.